first glance, this photograph seems like nothing more than a frozen moment of family life. A simple portrait taken in the autumn of 1901, when photography was becoming a cherished ritual for respectable households across America. The image shows 5 figures arranged with deliberate care: a father, a mother, 2 children, and a teenage daughter. Their clothes are neat, their posture stiff, their expression serious in the way all early portraits seem to demand. To the casual observer, it is the kind of picture you might expect to find tucked into an album, forgotten for decades until rediscovered by curious descendants. Ordinary, familiar, even comforting. And yet, this photograph is not what it seems. Within 3 days of this session, the family it portrays would no longer exist in the same way. Their home, once a symbol of security and modest prosperity, would become the scene of a tragedy that baffled authorities, shook neighbors, and left questions that echo more than a century later. What was captured here, in the seemingly steady gazes of its subjects, was not just a portrait. It was the final record of lives on the brink of collapse. When you know what unfolded after the shutter clicked, every detail in the picture feels charged with meaning. The father's arm drawn tightly across his chest. The mother's rigid hands folded in her lap. The daughter's unblinking stare, steady and unsettling for one so young. The younger children, still and watchful, as though they already sensed something was wrong. This is the story of how a single photograph became a haunting document of hidden despair. Before we continue, make sure to subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and leave a comment below with your thoughts, because what you're about to hear may change the way you look at every old photograph again. To understand the photograph, we first need to step back into the world in which it was taken. The year was 1901, a moment balanced between the old and the new. America was entering the 20th century with a sense of optimism, fueled by industry, railroads, and the growing confidence of a nation still young compared to the empires of Europe. Hartford, Connecticut, where this family lived, reflected that spirit. It was a prosperous city, marked by new factories, busy shops, and quiet neighborhoods where the middle class aspired to stability and respectability. In these neighborhoods, family portraits were more than simple souvenirs. They were symbols of permanence, proof that one had arrived at a certain level of success. Photography, once reserved for the wealthy, had become increasingly accessible. Studios offered affordable sittings with painted backdrops and carefully arranged props. A photograph declared not just who you were, but who you hoped to be remembered as. The father in this portrait was one such man chasing that respectability. A merchant by trade, he had built a modest business supplying fabrics to the city's growing population. Municipal records describe him as diligent, punctual, and ambitious. He was not wealthy, but he represented the American promise. Someone who had left behind a rural upbringing in Vermont to establish himself in a thriving urban center. His wife, by contrast, embodied the community's social heart. Neighbors later recalled her active role in church life, organizing charitable events and helping coordinate aid for struggling families. She had borne 5 children, though only 3 survived, an unfortunate but not uncommon reality in an era when infant mortality was high. Still, those who knew her said she carried herself with grace, investing her energy into faith, family, and appearances of stability. The children in the photograph reflected a spectrum of youth at the turn of the century. The eldest daughter, about 14, had recently begun attending a local school known for preparing students for higher studies. Friends described her as intelligent, though reserved, with a seriousness beyond her years. The younger two, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, were quieter, still bound to the safety of home and play. All of them together represented a picture-perfect image of the era's respectable family. They were neither rich nor poor, neither celebrated nor notorious. They were, in the eyes of the community, ordinary. And perhaps that is what made their story so unsettling. Because in their ordinariness, they seemed like anyone else. But beneath the polished clothing, the carefully arranged studio setting, and the straight-backed posture, cracks were beginning to show. Cracks invisible to outsiders, but ones that, in time, would fracture the entire household. This photograph was not only a family portrait. It was, unknowingly, the opening scene in a story of desperation and mystery that Hartford would never forget. At first glance, the portrait gives every impression of being carefully staged, just like thousands of others from its time. The backdrop, painted to resemble a grand interior, hints at elegance. A small table with an artificial marble top sits to one side, while a heavy curtain frames the group, lending formality to the composition. These props were typical of studio work in 1901, chosen to elevate the subjects above the plainness of everyday life. Yet, when studied closely, this particular photograph seems to resist its own perfection. The father stands slightly to the left, rather than occupying the central, dominant place customarily given to the patriarch. His right arm crosses tightly over his chest, a gesture more defensive than proud. His gaze, though steady, carries a flicker of unease, as though he were shielding more than simply his body. Beside him, the mother sits rigidly. While her attire is neat and appropriate, her posture betrays strain. Her shoulders are lifted ever so slightly, her hands clasped firmly in her lap. Not a relaxed pose, but one that suggests she is holding herself together, keeping something internal from breaking through. The eldest daughter is perhaps the most striking presence. Unlike the polite softness one might expect from a teenager in such a portrait, her stare is piercing. It is the look of someone older than her years, someone forced to confront burdens she cannot share. The intensity in her eyes unsettles those who study the image today because it suggests knowledge or fear she should not have had to carry. The younger two, a boy and a girl, are more neutral in expression, but even their faces resist the innocence expected of children. Their lips press together tightly, their eyes carry a dim apprehension, as though they sense the strain around them but cannot name it. Together, the family does not project unity so much as tension frozen in place. Curiously, the photograph contains almost no personal embellishment. There are no heirlooms, no favorite books, no treasured trinkets on display, nothing to reveal individuality. Beyond a simple wedding band, they present themselves stripped of ornament, as though eager to appear respectable yet invisible. For a family with community standing, the choice is peculiar. Was it humility or fear of drawing attention? Technically, the image is competent. The lighting is even, the focus crisp, the exposure handled with care. The photographer was experienced. And yet, minor irregularities creep into the frame. A faint shadow, slightly misaligned, suggests last-minute adjustments. The faintest blur on one figure's shoulder reveals a movement during the long exposure. These details, nearly invisible at first, lend the image an undercurrent of restlessness, as if remaining still for those few seconds proved unusually difficult. Viewed without knowledge of what followed, the photograph would pass as ordinary. But once we know the fate awaiting this family only days later, every stiffness, every shadow, every gaze becomes unbearable to ignore. It no longer feels like a portrait, feels like a warning. 3 days after the photograph was taken, ordinary life in Hartford was shattered. It began with a neighbor, a woman who lived in the house next door, pausing in her chores one Thursday morning. From the direction of the family's home came the sound of raised voices, urgent, sharp, not the usual household clamor. She hesitated, unsure whether to intervene. In 1901, domestic disputes were considered private matters, and few dared intrude. An hour passed. Then came the screams, louder this time, desperate enough to jolt her from hesitation. She called her husband, and together they approached the house. They knocked, called out, and waited. Silence answered. The curtains were drawn tight, though that alone was not unusual. Still, something in the air felt wrong. Reluctantly, they sought the sheriff. By midday, the authorities arrived. They, too, attempted to call inside, to knock, to wait for an answer. None came. Breaking into a home was a grave decision at the time, but the growing alarm left no choice. When the deputies forced the door, what they found would become etched in Hartford's memory. The father lay near the front window. His body collapsed in a position that spoke of violence, not accident. The mother was discovered in the hallway, as if she had tried to flee toward the stairs but never made it. The two youngest children were found together inside a closet beneath the staircase, arms entwined as though clinging to one another for safety. The eldest daughter, whose stare in the photograph had seemed so unusual, was discovered in the kitchen, not far from the back door. No valuables were missing. The doors had been locked from within, the windows latched. The scene bore no signs of an intruder. Yet the injuries, the scattering of the family across different rooms, and the suddenness of it all defied simple explanation. The sheriff and his men, accustomed to quarrels, robberies, even the occasional crime of passion, found themselves confronted with something that resisted every familiar pattern. Word spread quickly. Neighbors whispered in disbelief. Some recalled tensions within the household, muffled arguments overheard in summer months. Others swore the family had seemed respectable, even exemplary. The press, always hungry for a story, descended. Headlines framed the case as both tragedy and mystery, turning an ordinary family into the subject of national speculation. The photograph, once a keepsake of family pride, became evidence, examined for hints, clues, anything that might explain the horror. What had been meant as a memory of stability now stood as a haunting reminder of how quickly that stability could unravel. And the questions that began on that Thursday morning would not fade. They would grow louder, stranger, more unsettling, as investigators tried to make sense of what had happened behind those drawn curtains. The investigation began the very afternoon the bodies were discovered. The sheriff sealed off the home, and word quickly spread through Hartford that something dreadful had taken place. Reporters crowded the street, neighbors gathered in clusters, and whispers carried faster than facts. For the authorities, however, the challenge was immediate. How could a family vanish so violently, with no sign of an intruder? The first conclusion considered was murder-suicide, a grim possibility the coroner did not dismiss. Financial documents found in the father's study revealed debts and business troubles, hidden behind the polished surface of respectability. Letters from suppliers spoke of overdue accounts, of shipments unpaid, of credit refused. The weight of such secrets could crush a man's spirit, especially in a community where reputation was survival. But there were problems with that theory. The injuries did not align neatly with a single weapon or act of desperation. Some wounds suggested blunt force, others sharp edges, even different angles of attack. If the father had acted in despair, how could the scene appear so chaotic, so scattered? Why were the children discovered hidden in a closet, as if someone had deliberately tried to shield them? Witness accounts complicated matters further. Neighbors described the father as reserved but not cruel, diligent rather than volatile. The mother was remembered as gentle, her devotion to her children evident in every action. The eldest daughter had been seen the very morning of the tragedy walking toward school, calm enough to greet a neighbor watering her garden. Yet she never arrived at class. At some point, she returned home, though why remained a mystery. Even stranger were reports of visitors. In the weeks before the tragedy, 3 unfamiliar men were seen near the family store and, on occasion, outside their home. They asked questions about finances, spoke in low tones, and paid in cash at the local inn. Their sudden disappearance after the incident raised suspicions, but no names were ever recorded, no identities confirmed. The press, eager for sensation, painted the story in shifting colors. One day it was a tale of a desperate father crushed by debt. The next, it was speculation about shadowy creditors and secret schemes. Each article deepened the mystery, but none resolved it. For investigators, the greatest frustration was the silence of the evidence itself. Locked doors, untouched valuables, and conflicting testimony offered no single path to truth. Was this a collapse from within, a family crushed by private despair, or had external pressures forced them into tragedy? The answers remained elusive, and with each passing day, the photograph of the family, taken just before it all unraveled, grew heavier with meaning. What once was memory now demanded interpretation, as if the frozen expressions might somehow explain the chaos that followed. For most tragedies, the shock fades with time. Investigations close, families grieve, and communities move on. But this case refused to rest. Each new discovery, each stray recollection, only deepened the shadows around it. What had begun as a local mystery soon evolved into a puzzle that stretched across years. 2 weeks after the burials, a hidden letter was uncovered in the family's home. Wedged between floorboards in the master bedroom, it had escaped the initial search. Written by the mother to her sister in another state, the letter painted a picture very different from despair. Far from hopeless, she spoke of cautious optimism. A potential investor had shown interest in buying the business, a chance to settle debts and start anew. Plans were even forming to move west, where her brother had offered help establishing a shop. Such words did not belong to a woman standing at the edge of collapse. The letter also contained troubling lines. She mentioned strange visitors who lingered near the store and asked questions that felt intrusive. They seemed to know more about the family's finances than they should, and their sudden appearance unsettled her. These men were never identified, but their presence cast doubt on the official verdict. If opportunity lay ahead, why would despair alone explain the tragedy? Years later, further analysis reopened interest. Researchers noted inconsistencies in the crime scene reports, conflicting witness statements, overlooked details about the father's last days, and even questions about the timeline of events. Some suggested the family might have fallen victim to predatory creditors or fraudulent schemes common in that era. Others whispered of darker possibilities, violence carried out by outsiders who ensured the blame fell within the household. Meanwhile, the photograph persisted. Reproduced in books and newspapers, it became an object of fascination. Observers claimed to see fear in the mother's eyes, tension in the father's stance, or hidden sorrow in the children's expressions. Whether those impressions were real or projected, the image acquired a life of its own, transforming from portrait to omen. As decades passed, the mystery found new audiences. Historians treated it as a case study of middle-class fragility during economic upheaval. Psychologists analyzed it as an example of the human mind grappling with loss and uncertainty. For ordinary people, it was simply haunting, a reminder that even the most stable lives might conceal storms no one else can see. The story refused to end because it never had a clear conclusion. With every letter found, every rumor repeated, the boundary between fact and speculation blurred further. What remained was not certainty, but a photograph, a single moment frozen in time, forever demanding answers that history cannot provide. By the time the official inquiry closed, Hartford was ready to move forward. Shops reopened, church bells rang on Sundays, and daily life resumed its familiar rhythm. Yet the photograph lingered. Unlike the reports that yellowed in archives or the rumors that faded in memory, the portrait endured as a constant reminder. It asked questions in silence that no one could satisfactorily answer. On the surface, it was a simple family image, meant to capture respectability at the turn of the century. But viewed in light of the tragedy, it became something else entirely. A mirror reflecting the fragile line between stability and collapse. Every stiff posture, every locked expression seemed to contain hidden weight. Even if those impressions are projections made by later eyes, the photograph has become inseparable from the fate that followed. It also symbolizes a broader truth about the era. The early 20th century was a time of transformation, when middle-class families sought security in a rapidly shifting world. Success could be achieved through diligence, yet it could be undone overnight by debt, illness, or chance misfortune. Families like this one represented both the promise and the peril of modern life, outwardly composed, inwardly vulnerable. There is also something timeless in the way the photograph unsettles us. It reminds us that appearances deceive. Social media today performs a role not unlike those studio portraits of 1901, presenting carefully curated versions of life, polished, ordered, respectable. Behind those polished surfaces, struggles often remain hidden until they erupt. The story of this family becomes not just a historical curiosity but a warning still relevant now. Perhaps this is why the image has been reproduced in countless books and articles. It is not only about what happened in Hartford. It is about the human desire to find meaning in tragedy, to seek signs where perhaps none were intended. We search the father's tense arm, the daughter's gaze, the children's wary faces for clues, as though hindsight might reveal destiny written on their expressions. In truth, the photograph may reveal nothing beyond the ordinary discomfort of sitting still for long exposure. Yet once entwined with the story, it can never return to innocence. It became unwillingly a memorial, an emblem of how swiftly life can shift from ordinary to unthinkable. And that is the unsettling power of a single image. It forces us to look not only at the family captured in 1901 but at ourselves, our own illusions of permanence, and the realities we prefer to hide behind smiles and posed appearances. More than a century has passed since that photograph was taken, yet its power has not faded. For the family, it was meant to be a token of stability, an heirloom to pass down to future generations. Instead, it became a silent witness to their final days, a haunting record of lives cut short under circumstances that remain unresolved. What makes the story endure is not only the tragedy itself, but the uneasy questions it leaves behind. Was it despair, or something darker? Was the family's fate sealed by pressures from within, or by unseen forces pressing from without? The truth remains hidden, locked away in the silence of time. What we are left with is an image. 5 faces frozen in place, unaware of how history would interpret every line and shadow. And perhaps that is why the photograph still matters today. It reminds us how fragile our illusions of permanence can be. Behind every carefully composed picture, whether from a studio in 1901 or a social media feed today, there may lie struggles invisible to the world. The story challenges us to look closer, to question what we think we see, and to remember that even ordinary moments can conceal extraordinary mysteries. If you found this journey compelling, I invite you to continue exploring with us. Subscribe to Grave of the Shadows and join a community fascinated by the mysteries history has tried to bury. Each week, we uncover forgotten photographs, overlooked documents, and stories that demand to be remembered. And don't just watch, share your thoughts in the comments. What do you see in this photograph? Do you sense tension, fear, or only hindsight reshaping the image? Your perspective adds to the story, ensuring it will never truly fade into silence.